All right, so let me start just by setting the scene. There has been since the 90s raising interest and a raise in the number of papers using happiness scales in economics, but also in social sciences in general. And usually the question we ask in this paper is, what makes people happy? And since we do not observe happiness, like the latent happiness, what we use are measures of well-being, such as the Cantril ladder that Martijn mentioned yesterday. But we also use the life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life, all things considered? And then we give respondents a scale, 3 to 11 categories. And then what we do, as Andrew was saying this morning, OLS, because OLS rules. We just run linear models. And with Caspar, we have a companion paper where we actually reviewed the literature in economics over the last 15 years, and we found that more than 98% of the regressions run over the last 15 years are linear regression. So OLS rules, and that's what we all do. But the thing is, happiness scales are not free of criticism. And we have, I think, all heard critiques about the measure, many critiques, different shape, different forms. But in economics, 2 critiques really not emerged, but gained traction recently. The first one comes from Carsten Schroeder and the regretted Shlomo Yitzhaki, 2017. And in their paper, they started discussing the hypothesis of linearity. I'm going to come back to what I mean by linearity in a couple of slides. And then came 2 years after, Journal of Political Economy, Bond and Lang, The Sad Truth About Happiness Scales. This is the title of the paper. And in this paper, you have 20 pages of critiques. And there are some critiques about linearity, and another critique that they make is about homogeneity within response category. All of these critiques have a direct implication on our work, is that if you start relaxing some of these assumptions that we make in our research, then you can reverse the sign of subjective well-being coefficients. So say, for instance, you are running a regression, life satisfaction on income. You're very likely to get a positive point estimate. Well, if you start playing around with these assumptions of linearity and homogeneity, this sign can become very easily negative, which is kind of scary, because it means that everything we have accumulated, all this knowledge that we have been building together, may very well be obsolete if you start playing around with these assumptions. So this risk of reversal, the idea that a sign can change, is at the heart. It's at the basis of our paper with Caspar. And we asked 2 main research questions. The first one looked at the past. And we asked to what extent the stock of well-being knowledge we have accumulated so far is threatened by the risk of reversal. Can we really destroy everything so easily? And something maybe a bit more optimistic, looking at the future, is the risk of reversal inevitable? Or do we have agency over this risk? Can we identify research practices that we could implement in the future to minimize the risk of reversal? So these are the 2 main questions of this paper. We have spent almost 3 years working on this paper, and this is not because we're just taking some time off. We have been working almost full-time for 3 years on this paper, because to address it, we used several ingredients. The first one is a theoretical ingredient. We have been working on econometric theory to design a test that would allow us to run a regression and then understand if your point estimate that you're finding, your treatment effect, the effect of income, how sensitive it is to the assumptions of linearity and homogeneity. And since I was a student of Andrew, we started with the sign, but then we also looked at significance and magnitude. So now our test tells you everything. It's not only it's positive and it can become negative, it also says it's significant, be careful. Maybe it's not going to become negative, but you can lose the significance. So our test does all these things. If you don't speak math fluently like myself, well, you can forget about the first part, and you can directly go to Stata, because we have built the command to run our test. And I'm going to give you a GitHub link at the end of this presentation so that you can already download it and set it up on your Stata. We also ran an online survey, actually a month ago, to try to derive some parameters for our test. I will come back to this later. And then, now we have all these ingredients. We have this theory, we have this test on Stata. So what we need now is data. So we brought our test to a data set that we call Wellbeing. Again, I will describe it later, to quantify the risk of reversal and to learn from it. What can we do to minimize this risk? And our conclusion, if ever I can't make it in time, so just for you to know, the thing that I want really to communicate with you is that if we look at the past, we actually learn many things. It's not that easy to reverse point estimates, at least under plausible assumption. If you make crazy assumptions about happiness scales, sure, you can reverse estimates, but it's very unlikely to happen. Typically, unemployment comes with a negative effect. It's very difficult to turn it into something positive. Income is positive in most of our regressions. It's almost impossible to make it negative. Looking at the future, great news, we have agency over the risk of reversal. And here I'm going to highlight two elements, exogeneity and statistical power. And I will come back to this also later. And if I have time, I'll just temper a little bit my speech here by just saying that there are some looming threats that remain. Sure, for the sign, flipping a sign is not that easy. However, losing significance can happen quite easily. And in terms of magnitude, point estimates also tend to change very easily when you relax these assumptions. So I'm going to skip the contributions. I hope you will believe me when I'm telling you that we are contributing to the literature. At least I hope we are. And I'm going now to enter the details of the paper. So I'm going to start with some theory. But again, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not like hardcore econometrician. So we're going to stay together at the level of intuition. And I think there is maybe one equation. And I hope you're going to forgive me for this. So let's start with the basics. When we run, when we want to estimate a point estimate, the common strategy is to take happiness, like reported happiness, a scale of life satisfaction. We run an OLS, and we have the covariate X. And usually what we do is that the first category of happiness is 1, the second is 2, the third is 3, and so on and so forth. When we are running such a regression, we are making we're making a set of assumptions. 2 of them were heavily criticized by Schroeder-Inisaki and Bondenleg. The first one is linearity. I already mentioned it several times. So what do I mean by linearity? Here I mean that the difference in the unobserved well-being is constant across response category. In simple word, when I go from 1 to 2 on a happiness scale, is the same as going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 6. It's an equal difference in terms of underlying well-being. The other assumption that we make is that of homogeneity, which is that the underlying well-being within a response category is the same across individuals or groups. So to give you a concrete example, if Martin and I will respond to a life satisfaction question, 0 to 10, Martin and I were like decently happy guys, so we're going to say 9 and 9. So we all would conclude, well, then they are equally happy. But actually, Martin says 9, but if he were to use a continuous scale, maybe it would be a 9.1, and I would be an 8.9. So we're just using 9, the two of us, because it's the category that is the closest to our true happiness. But we would make a mistake. We would say, oh, they are equally happy. Well, actually, we are not. So this is the hypothesis of homogeneity. We assume that within a response category, everybody is equally happy. So what we're doing here is that we develop a test where we're going to have parameters to quantify the assumptions of linearity and the assumption of homogeneity. And then we're going to see, are point estimates sensitive to these assumptions? Our starting point was a paper that my co-author wrote a couple of years ago, where he already worked on the first assumption, that of linearity. And he found that a reversal, a sign reversal, can happen if the effect of X is positive on some part of the happiness distribution and negative on the other part of the distribution. In practice, how do you detect a sign reversal? Well, you can do this very simple iterative process where you are going to estimate the effect of X on the probability to be in the first happiness category versus the rest. Then you re-estimate the effect of X on the probability to be in the first 2 happiness categories versus the rest, and so on and so forth. And if throughout this process the effect of X changes, then it means that a reversal is possible. And to give you here a concrete example, you can see 3 specifications. It's a life satisfaction regression with income. And you can see, unsurprisingly, the effect is positive and significant. In model 1, you have no controls. Model 3, you have all the controls plus individual fixed effects. And under the point estimates, you can see that there is a line that says whether you can reverse, yes or no, a point estimate. And you can see that 2 out of 3 models, you can reverse the point estimate of income. Where does that come from? It comes from the graph that is just below here on this part. Yes, so this graph here below the table. This graph, so in HD1 here, for instance, it shows you, where there is the hand here, yes, it shows you the effect of the probability to be in the first happiness category versus the rest. And the yellow line is for model 1, the purple line is for model 2, and the blue line is for model 3. Then you can see it's all negative. Then you move to HD2. HD2 shows you the probability of being in the first 2 happiness categories versus the rest. It's negative again, and so on and so forth. And you can see that for the blue and the purple lines, it's always negative. There is no change in the sign. So you cannot reverse the sign of income. While with the yellow line, the last point here, an HD10, unfortunately here, we observe a sign switch. So it's a small, very small point estimates, but it means that there is at least one transformation of the happiness scale that would provoke a reversal of the sign. So you may be stretching the scale in a way that is completely implausible, but that would be enough to all of a sudden have a negative effect of income. And so what did we learn from the first paper of my co-author? Well, we learned when a coefficient can be reversed, yes or no. And in his first paper, he focused on exponential transformation. So he basically identified with his co-author, Caspar, what is the exponential transformation, so exponential C, that would allow such reversal. And to give you an example, if C is equal to 0, then this is the standard framework. We assume that the distance between the points is the same. And if you have 0.4, you see you start to stretch the scale in a way that is maybe a bit weird, maybe not plausible, but maybe this is enough to reverse point estimates. So this is a starting point. So when I read this paper of Caspar for the first time, I was like, this is exactly the direction I want to take with this big project, but that's not enough. Why? Because first, why just focusing on the exponential transformation? Any positive monotonic transformation is interesting per se. It's possible. The exponential transformation is just one example. So what we did, and I was talking about it with Joe just before this presentation, we actually found an algorithm that has 2 properties. The first is that our algorithm is going to find, conditional on reversal. Our algorithm is going to find a transformation that is, 1, sufficient to provoke a reversal, and 2, deviates the least from the linear case. So our objective is to identify the most plausible manipulation of the scale that would provoke a reversal. And once we identified this transformation of the scale, then we convert it into a cost index that has some nice properties. It's bounded between 0 and 1. It is scale invariant. And why do we call it cost index? It's the cost of deviating from linearity. This is why we have here the idea of cost. And so here comes the algorithm, the cost function. So no math for today, so I'm going to skip it. And what I want to show you on this graph, on these graphs, is how our cost works. So in the first, like here on the top left for you, we have a 45-degree line. And here on the x-axis, it's your reported happiness, and the y-axis is the true, unobserved happiness, the continuous happiness. So when you have a 45-degree line, then you have a cost of 0, and it's when the distance between 1 and 2 on the reported scale maps perfectly a distance between 1 and 2 in unobserved happiness. Unobserved happiness. And then you can see like the cost increases from one figure to another. We start with 0.01, and then we go up to 1. And then you start seeing these gray lines showing up around the 45-degree lines. And so basically these gray lines, they show you transformation of the scale that is associated with a cost of 0.1, 0.25, 0.5. And you can see that the larger the cost, the more distance we're taking from the linear case, the more weird, the more like we're stretching more and more the scale. And so here the question is, we have a tool that allows us to identify all these positive monotonic transformation, but we just don't know which one is the most plausible. Maybe people use the scale in a very linear way, so we would be here, or maybe they are absolutely not linear. Maybe they have a cost of 0.5. At this stage, we don't know. But our algorithm allows us to identify any transformation that would reverse the sign of a point estimate, and then it translates it into a cost. This is for linearity. What we have added also in the test, in our test, is the fact that there is a parameter which is measuring heterogeneity within response category. Bringing back this example I took with Martin, is a 9.1, I'm an 8.9. We have now a gamma parameter that would capture this difference of 0.2 between the two of us. And that's exactly what our gamma does. We put it on the scale to separate people. And we say, OK, fine, let's assume that men and women are systematically different when they respond to the satisfaction scale within a response category. Let's assume that unemployed and employed are different. You can name it, and then we put distance between people within the response category, which allows us, if you put it all together, to actually play around with second line linearity. You can see here, second line, we drop linearity, we play around, we just make the categories move in terms of distance. And here in the third case, when you introduce heterogeneity, then in the category 0, actually, our respondents are not all equal to 0. There is a distance between A and B. There is distance between Martin and I. And here, just for the sake of simplicity, we are going to assume that the heterogeneity within response category is the same across all the categories, meaning that Martin and I, we say 9, but there is a difference of 0.2 between the two of us. If we would have said 6, there would still be this difference of 0.2. This is just to make our life easier. This is because I've burned already a computer with this paper, so I'm just trying to save this laptop, and I don't want to overcharge it with too many computations. But in theory, you could very well say, I want heterogeneity in this part of the distribution, and I don't want any in the other part. Completely possible. So here now we're at the stage where we have two parameters, cost for the linearity, gamma for heterogeneity. But we have still no clue about what are plausible values for this parameter. So what we did with Caspar a month ago, we collected our own survey through Prolifix and Qualtrics, and we designed a set of questions and experiments to try to infer from our respondents how they use the scale of happiness. Are they using it in a linear way or in a nonlinear way? Do they differ within response category, yes or no? So I'm going to be brief on this, but these are the kind of exercise we did. And also something that Andrew once told me is that in economics, everything is equal to 0.1, right? It's like sort of golden number in economics. Well, we ended up with a cost of 0.1. So I think that's enough. I think that makes it more than valid. Then when it comes to deviation from homogeneity, what we did is that we asked our respondents on a scale of 0 to 10, how happy are you? 5. And then we asked them, wait, you said 5. But maybe you wanted to give us a more precise number. So please, tell us. So that in this way, we can do this exercise. I think Martin is a 9, I'm a 9, but actually we are not really the same number. And so this was actually an interesting exercise because at the end of the day, what we realized is that people, when they say a 6, they all mean the same number. There is not like such big heterogeneity across people. We have tried everything by gender, by age, by employment status, education. Now, when people use the scale, they use it in a very similar way. So the most conservative number we managed to find, it's almost the golden number. It's 0.05, which is nothing more than 0.1 divided by 2. So we're good. We still have the golden number in the paper. Then here you can tell me, yes, but this is like a very specific survey. It's about the UK. It's you designed the questions to maybe you influence your respondents, whatever. So what gave us a lot of reassurance is that actually Dan Benjamin and his co-author themselves collected a survey a year ago in the US, and they asked a series of questions that actually can also be used to detect linearity and homogeneity. And when we used their data set that was not meant to measure these parameters, in a US sample, we got exactly the same number. So that gave us a lot of reassurance. So now we're at the stage where we have a test. We know which parameter to plug in our test. So now what we need is data. We're going to use Wellbeing in this project. So again, some of you know already Wellbeing, but if you don't, in a nutshell, Wellbeing is, I think, one of my craziest ideas, something I thought I could do in 2 weeks, but actually it took me 2 years to do it. It's basically the reproduction of the universe of the most recent estimates coming from well-being regressions published in top econ journal. So I remember perfectly 2 years ago with Caspar in Luxembourg, telling him at 2 a.m. in the morning, leave this part to me, you'll see, in 2 weeks, we have them all. So 2 years after, here we are. Wellbeing started with a Google Scholar search. We looked for life satisfaction, country ladder, subjective well-being, papers published since 2010, and in top 13 econ journal according to RIPEC. And we ended up with 345 published articles, so a lot of papers. So what are we looking for precisely in these papers? Well, we are looking for regressions where you have well-being as the dependent variable and some independent variables at the individual level. And here, let me just say that Wellbeing is more than just a database of coefficients. We just don't copy-paste point estimate when we find them in papers. We actually we're going back to the data. We are using the replication package, and we reproduce the paper. Sometimes from scratch when there is no replication package, but when there is replication package, then we can just start at the moment of the regression. So of course, we did not reproduce 345 papers because not all of them have at least one regression. Some mention happiness, some use happiness as an independent variable. So at the end of the day, when we did our selection, we ended up with 57 articles, which is still a lot. And as of today, I think we are at the stage where we won't be able to go further in the replication process. We have replicated 47 papers, and 10 of them, like the last 10, I'm afraid we won't be able to replicate them because they're based on admin data, or like it's really, really difficult for us to get access to the data without being co-authors on the initial paper. Who knows, maybe in the future we're going to make it, but for the moment I think it's unlikely. But still, 47 papers, just to give you an idea of what it means more than 1,000 of regressions, and it means more than 50,000 point estimates. 10% of them are published estimates, so you would see them in papers, but 90% of them are control variables. And that's the beauty of replicating the paper. Like, we do not only care about what the authors wanted us to see, we can actually infer and get information out of the whole model. So we have plenty of information about, well, we know everything about these regressions, basically. So for this paper, we don't use the full version of Wellbeing, again, for my laptop, partly, but we also excluded the nonlinear, the coefficient coming from nonlinear estimators, and at the end of the day, we are working with roughly 25,000 point estimates. And so I'm going to do two things with this data set. I'm going to start by asking the question, to what extent is the well-being research really exposed to the risk of reversal? And I think, Stephanie, now after half an hour, I'm going to show the first result, right? Yeah, OK, then more or less on track. All right, so here's a graph where on the x-axis, you will see the cost. So remember, the cost, when it's equal to 0, we're using the scale as linear, and when it goes to 1, it's the moment where we start stretching it in all direction, very implausible direction. At the origin of the graph here, the 0, this is us, well-being researchers. We assume linearity, we assume homogeneity, so there is no reversal. For us, the concept of reversal doesn't exist in a way. But here, this is what happened when you enter the world of Carsten, Schroeder, and Yitzhaki, and when you start assuming that maybe linearity is not the way to proceed forward. Maybe we should be open to other manipulation of the scale. Basically, 60% of point estimates could be reversed only if you start relaxing linearity. So of course here, these transformations are, in a way, a bit crazy, but it's possible. Here I'm just quantifying a potential risk. And then if you enter the world of Bond and Lang, you add heterogeneity, so you assume that people within a category are not the same. And then you get to this figure where you have almost 85% of reversal. So if I'm showing you this graph, it's not to scare anybody in the room, but it's just more to use it as sort of guiding, or like sort of map, a guiding tool, to try to understand where are people on this figure. So here at the origin, it's us, well-being researchers. When you relax linearity, this is Schroeder and Yitzhaki. So this is the cost of linearity. And this is the beginning of Bond and Lang, when you start introducing heterogeneity. And this is when you put on top of it linearity. And here, Bond and Lang would say you can reverse 100% of the point estimates. In our case, we only get to 85%, but it's because here we are giving to heterogeneity like a structural form. And I've told you, at the end of the day, people use the scale in the same way. But if we were again to assume that people within a response category are very distant, then we would push the button of heterogeneity at the maximum, we would get also to the 100%. So this graph here is has to be used more as an illustration tool, not something that is reality. It's just to quantify the risks. And do not forget that a plausible cost is at 0.1, and in this case, only 12% of our point estimates can be reversed if you relax linearity, and 40% can be relaxed if you put some heterogeneity. So, shall we be scared still about these figures? Well, actually, I don't think we should, because something I haven't mentioned yet so far is that these critiques of linearity and homogeneity, they apply to well-being scales, but in practice, they apply to any ordinal scale. So if you're working with self-reported happiness, self-reported health, sorry, if you're working with preferences for a distribution, if you're working with quality of a crop, like basically everything that use a Likert scale, then you can apply our reasoning, and the critique also applies. It seems that there is a double standard for well-being scales. Not sure I really understand why. So what we ended up doing is that, when we're in this sort of madness of replicating papers, we also replicated papers in economics, in top 5 journals, that are based on, in which there is a regression with a Likert scale. So preferences for a distribution, for instance. And this is the gray line here. You can see that the risk of reversal with this other Likert scale that are exposed to the risk, but nobody's saying anything about them, the risk of reversal is actually larger. So there is a double standard for us. I don't know why. Once Kelsey, my friend Kelsey O'Connor, told me that all point estimates are not created equally. And so when I was showing you the first graph with all the point estimates, he told me, yes, but some of them, nobody cares about them. They're just control variables. They're like very small magnitude. So what would be more interesting maybe is to look at significant point estimates, the one that we are commenting in our papers. So here is the graph when you only look at significant point estimates. And what I like about this graph is that here, if you look at the 0.1, which is our plausible deviation from linearity, it's impossible to reverse a point estimate. Here we are at 0.2%. So the risk of reversal exists, but if your point estimate to start with is highly significant, I think you are in the clear. Then you can also look at income, coefficients, positive coefficients of income, almost impossible to reverse. And my favorite, unemployment. Unemployment is negative, and it's almost impossible to plausibly reverse and make it into a positive coefficient. Just not happening. All right, so this was about the past. I think we're good. But then can we learn something about this coefficient? Is there something we can do in the future to try to reduce this risk of reversal? Well, with Caspar, we were thinking about when we run a regression, what is under our control? What do we know before running, going on Stata and typing reg, life satisfaction, income? Well, what we know is already our measure of well-being. We know how many categories there are in this variable. If you are running your own survey, well, actually, you can even design yourself. You can change the number of categories. You can go for a country ladder. You can go for life satisfaction. So we have control over the well-being scale. We have obviously control over the estimation sample. It's usually related to your research question, but we are the ones saying, I want people between age 18 to 65. I want only men. I want only women. We're in charge of this. The econometric model, obviously, that's our choice. If you use 2SLS, OLS, fixed effect, your choice. And last but not least, the independent variable. You know it, and typically we're talking about it this morning. Income, we don't use it usually in continuous. We log it, or maybe sometimes we use dummies. So we have controls, more or less, over all these things. So what we do in the second part of the paper is that we run this very simple linear probability model where the dependent variable is a dummy that is equal to 1 if a coefficient E from a paper P from a regression R can be reversed. 0 if it cannot be reversed. And we try to understand to what extent the features of the scale matters, the features of the estimation sample matter. The econometric model, the independent variable, are all these characteristics, do they matter at the end of the day? Are they shaping the risk of reversal? And I'm going to show you two models, two linear probability model, one without the t-stat and one with the t-stat. So why am I treating the t-stat differently? It's because the t-stat is not something we choose. It's actually the outcome of all the decisions we have taken before running our model. So that's why I'm giving it a sort of intermediary position. I'm going to not control for it, and then I'm going to control for it. And these are the results of the two models. So in blue, it's model 1 without the t-stat, and you can see the different features and how do they relate to the risk of reversal. So if a point estimate is on this side of the graph, it's on the right, then it means that this feature is increasing the risk of reversal. And if it's on the left part of the graph, it means that the features are reducing the risk of reversal. So there are many coefficients, and I'm a little bit tight in terms of time, so I'm going to focus on two main aspects here, two main results that I think are takeaway messages from this graph. If you look at individual fixed effects, if you look at natural experiment, and if you look at macroeconomic indicators, these variables, like these features, are associated with lower risk of reversal, which means that it's a win-win for us researchers, or at least for economists, because we know that editors like papers when there is causality. So here, if you have an individual fixed effect, it means that you are looking for some conditional exogeneity. If you have a natural experiment, if you are putting in macroeconomic indicators, these are arguably exogenous variation in your model. So not only is it going to help you publishing your paper, but it's also going to reduce the risk of reversal. So definitely that's one direction that could be taken to reduce the risk of reversal. Another thing I would like to mention is the last line, the absolute t-test, which is logged. I want to mention it for two reasons. First, it's the most precise point estimate, and it's also the one that is attracting the largest point estimate. It's the parameter in the model that is like the best predictor of the risk of reversal. So here, let's be very clear. I'm not telling you that you should p-hack your data. Like you should not try to find the right set of controls that is going to increase your, that's going to decrease your p-value. Absolutely not. It's more like, I think it has to be taken as a signal. If your point estimate is very significant to start with, then it's a good sign. It means that the risk of reversal is very low. So it's more like a sort of red or green flag. And overall, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 variables, they produce an R squared of 55. So with only these 10 characteristics, we can predict 55% of the variation of the risk of reversal. So we are doing a good job in understanding the dynamics behind the risk of reversal. So as Andrew was saying, we are also doing many robustness checks. Here we have different specification with journal fixed effect, with paper fixed effect, logit, probit. We're trying everything we can, and overall, our results remain very stable, which is nice, of course. And Stephanie, how much time do I have left? 2 minutes, and then I'm going to be very fast on this then, very, very fast. So, okay. So coming back to what Andrew said this morning, sign is great, but we need to talk about significance and magnitude. So what we can do also with our test is that we can also talk about significance first. And we can talk about potential type 1 and potential type 2 errors. So I'm going to go fast and showing you directly the results. Here I've classified estimates on the basis of their significance level in the classic case. So here we start with highly significant point estimates, and at the end, like the estimates that are absolutely not significant, like they have p-values above 75. This is a risk of type 1 error. So if you start playing around with the scale, actually very quickly point estimates lose their significance. This is not a great news for us, I think. We can do the same with type 2 error, but somewhat a little bit less important. About magnitudes. About magnitudes, what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to talk about the marginal rate of substitution between unemployment and income. Because this somehow, I think it gives some policy relevance to the question, and it allows us, and some people are arguing that we can convert unemployment into monetary unit. We can say, if I become unemployed, then this amount of money that should compensate for my unemployment. So this is the logic we're following here, marginal rate of substitution of income and unemployment. And this is what we find when we start playing around with the scale. So at the beginning here, at the cost equals 0, we have our original marginal rate of substitution. which is equal to 3, which means that the effect of unemployment is 3 times larger than the effect of income. But then the problem is when we start playing around with the scale, here you have the area that the marginal rate of substitution can take when we start playing around. And if you go very far, if you start really stretching the scale almost implausible way, the marginal rate of substitution technically can go from 10 to 2. So in terms of policy recommendation, it starts to be a bit more difficult. OK, so I'm going to conclude right now. So I think on what we did, you understood. Like we put together this database, we put together this theory, this online survey, and the Stata command. We put all these ingredients together to respond to the first question. If we look at the past, did we learn nothing? No, it's not true. We learned many, many things. If you think about plausible assumptions, like plausible deviation from linearity, plausible deviation from homogeneity, we still, like most of our results, still hold. Looking at the future, we are in charge of the risk of reversal. We have agency over it, which is a great news. Exogeneity, I'm going to put some emphasis on this, and statistical power just as a green light or red flag. Still some issue with the risk of significance reversal and marginal rate of substitution, and I'm just going to think about the future now. I think there will always be skeptical editors and referees with happiness scales. I think that's how it's going to be forever. But at least we are making progress. Chen et al., 2022, show that if we use median regression, then we can address the critique of Bond and Lang. So I would recommend you to not only use OLS, but also to move to median regression. That's another robustness checks we can add to the paper. Another thing you can do is to run your model and then run our command right after. And then our command will tell you, is your coefficient reversible, yes or no, and under which condition? And this is something you can give to the editor and to the referee. Say, OK, fine, sure, the critique exists, but I would have to stretch my scale in a way that is so implausible that this is not a valid critique that you can make. And obviously, there is still a lot of work to do, but I'm very happy to see that many of our brightest minds at ISQOLS are working on this topic. We have scale framing with the Martins and Yoshi, great paper that is going to come out soon. On scale norming, Alberto Prati is working on a great paper too, and on scale use heterogeneity, not members of ISQOLS, I think, for the moment, but there is still a great paper from Dan Benjamin and co-author. So still a lot of work to do, but I think we're going in the right direction. And so I'm just going to leave you on this one last slide. This is basically the link towards our command. We're in the beta testing phase. So I don't know, like maybe this is like a video gamer word, but like the beta testing is the moment where it's open source. You can go, you can check the code, and you can use it, and then send us your feedback, because we want this command to be as easy as possible to use. We think that we're at the stage where it is easy to use, but we have been working on it for 2 or 3 years. So I think we lack some perspective. So please, if you want to have a look and give us some feedback on this, that would be great. And thank you very much for your attention.